She was called the ugliest bride in Chicago, and nearly 500 guests filled the Grand Astoria ballroom that evening not to celebrate a wedding, but to witness the city's most feared mafia boss humiliate himself for a deal. Adeline Fairmont was 28, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running across her throat and thinning hair at her temples, and she walked toward the altar hiding absolutely nothing. At the front of the hall stood Roldan Vasquez, 37, a man who buried his enemies without raising his voice. And when she reached him, he did something no one in that mocking crowd expected, something they couldn't have known, something Roldan himself wouldn't fully understand until later, in the silence of his own home. The true shock of this marriage had nothing to do with the face the whole city mocked, and what he would discover beneath her wedding dress that very night would stagger every one of them. Adeline Fairmont stopped at the start of the aisle, feeling every pair of eyes slide across her shoulders, her neck, and the visible marks of a painful past she no longer tried to hide before turning away to whisper behind sparkling champagne glasses. She caught fragments of their words, that Roldan Vasquez must have been paid a fortune to stand beside such a woman, that even the Vasquez family's power couldn't buy her a decent face, that this was the most entertaining spectacle of the Chicago wedding season. She didn't lower her head. She had decided that morning, standing before the mirror and looking straight at her reflection, that today she would not make herself smaller just to make any of them comfortable. She walked forward, each step was steady. The heavy silk of her gown trailed across the marble floor, and at the far end of the aisle, Roldan waited with the impassive calm of a man accustomed to standing motionless in the middle of storms that sent everyone else running. Each step brought her closer to something she dared not name, not a marriage, but a gamble she'd never been asked to agree to, a transaction where she was merely a pawn on a board between two powerful men. When she reached him, the quiet laughter had not yet fully died, and someone hidden behind a fan let out a thin, sharp, venomous sound, the kind of laughter people reserve for what they believe is beneath them. Roldan heard every single sound. Not a single feature on his face flickered. He extended his hand to her, palm up, a gesture so small that almost no one noticed, but Adeline noticed. She placed her hand in his with the caution of someone who had never been offered help without being made to pay for it later. His hand was warm and dry. His fingers closed around her palm firmly enough to hold, but not so tightly as to become a grip. And in that brief moment, she felt something so unfamiliar it almost frightened her, the sensation of being supported. The priest began the ceremony in a low, even voice, and the familiar words about devotion and fidelity echoed through a room where everyone silently understood this was a deal dressed in the finest wedding attire. Adeline listened as the vows drifted past her ears, searching the face of the man beside her for that flicker of revulsion hidden beneath practiced politeness. She didn't find it, but she didn't find warmth either, only a daunting calm. And calmness from a man marrying her for his own gain sometimes sent a colder chill down her spine than open cruelty. Cruelty was something she understood, something she'd lived with her entire life, while calmness always concealed something she hadn't yet learned to recognize. When they spoke their responses, her voice didn't waver, and this seemed to disappoint several guests in the front row, as if they'd made the effort to come only to see her break, and she'd refused to give them the performance they wanted. The ceremony moved to the signing of the register. It was at this moment, as Adeline leaned down and pressed the pen to the page, that her father, Gerald Fairmont, rose from his place of honor and approached her. He was a tall man with neatly combed silver hair, and a face that radiated warmth honed over decades behind podiums, and in conference rooms where other people's fates were decided with a single nod. He smiled at the crowd with the smile of a proud father watching his daughter enter a new chapter of her life, then placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that appeared to 500 guests as nothing more than paternal affection. Adeline flinched. It wasn't a light tremor, but a sudden contraction of her entire body. The pen in her hand froze mid-page, leaving a small blot of spreading ink, and her shoulder beneath his palm went rigid, as if touched by something scorching hot that only she could feel. It lasted no longer than a moment, then she forced herself to regain composure, finishing the signature with a hand that was steady again. To the crowd, the moment passed so quickly it left no trace, but Roldan saw it. He stood close enough to notice everything, close enough to see the blood drain from his wife's face and slowly return, close enough to understand that her reaction was not the nervousness of a shy daughter before a crowd, but something more ancient and deeper. The kind of reflex a human body develops only after enduring many things it was powerless to resist. He said nothing. He didn't change his expression, didn't turn to look at Gerald, didn't let anyone in the room know that he had just added an important detail to a memory that never let go of anything it had managed to record. But beneath that impassiveness, a question took root, quietly, like a seed falling into dark soil. And Roldan Vasquez was not the kind of man who allowed such questions to remain unanswered forever. Gerald squeezed his daughter's shoulder one last time before removing his hand, nodded with impeccable courtesy to the priest, then turned back to the crowd with his still perfectly shining smile, while Adeline let out a faint, uneven breath that only the man beside her could hear. The ceremony ended with polite applause, mixed with curious glances and smiles hidden behind wine glasses. The orchestra began a soft melody, and the newlyweds turned to face the hall filled with people who had dressed in their finest clothes, only to witness what they considered a joke. Adeline held her chin high throughout the walk back down the aisle. Her hand still rested on her husband's arm, and Roldan matched her pace with measured steps, silently shielding her from their gazes with the breadth of his own shadow, never revealing that he was doing it deliberately. In his mind, the image of Gerald's hand on her shoulder and her instinctive recall repeated again and again, refusing to fade. He knew with the cold certainty of a man who had spent his life reading people, before they could speak, that this marriage concealed darker truths than anyone in that glittering ballroom could imagine, and that whatever the answer was, it wouldn't remain hidden in the dark for long. 3 weeks before that night in the Grand Astoria ballroom, Roldan Vasquez stood alone in the dim study of his lakeside estate, watching the lights of Chicago reflect in the water, black as oil. For the first time in many years, he felt something he hated above all else, the sensation of slowly losing control. On the walnut desk before him lay a stack of documents delivered that afternoon by the family's lead attorney, and their contents told him this storm was unlike any he had ever weathered. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had launched an investigation under the statute designed to combat organized crime syndicates, known in their world by the cold, lifeless acronym RICO, and they weren't aiming at an isolated link to later abandon their efforts. They were aiming at the structure itself, the roots, the very name Vasquez that his father had built and Roldan had protected with a hand that was said never to tremble. The family accounts, both legal and those existing in the grey zone, he'd spent a decade weaving into a vast network of real estate and shipping stretching along the city's southern harbour, had been frozen almost simultaneously within 48 hours. Buildings registered under shell companies were sealed, contracts awaiting signatures quietly cancelled, and people who once bowed to him in restaurants suddenly became suspiciously busy whenever his name was mentioned. Roldan understood the language of power too well not to recognize that if you cut off the cash flow, everything else would collapse. An empire without financial circulation was nothing more than a beautiful corpse waiting to decompose. Even the most loyal people would start calculating their options once they smelled ruin. He was not one to panic easily. His entire life had taught him to maintain an impassive face even when everything inside was burning. He knew he still had secret channels, connections saved precisely for such desperate times, and ways to untangle any knot one by one with the same cold composure that had built his reputation. But that required time, months, perhaps years, and time was exactly what he didn't have. The feds were tightening the noose, and they weren't going to stand still waiting for him to find a way out. What stood at the window with him wasn't fear for his own skin, but thoughts of Fior, his 26-year-old sister, the only woman he had never, not once in his life, allowed near his criminal world. He had spent his youth shielding her name so she could grow up as an ordinary person, study, fall in love, marry by her own choice into one of the oldest and most respected families, where reputation was valued even more than money. And now, as newspaper headlines began to carefully link the Vasquez name with the phrase federal investigation, the family of Fior's fiancé had delicately conveyed a message, polite but cold as ice. They proposed postponing the engagement until the situation was clarified. Both sides understood perfectly what that diplomatic language meant. It was the end. Fior had come to him the previous day, trying to act as if everything was fine, attempting to smile, saying that if someone left her over an investigation that hadn't even concluded, then that person had never truly loved her. But Roldan saw the redness in her eyes when she turned away. And it was that image, not the frozen accounts, that squeezed his heart in a vice. He could survive losing money. He'd lost it and won it back so many times that it no longer kept him awake. But he couldn't bear the thought that the life he had chosen, the world he'd immersed himself in to protect what remained of his family after his father's death, had become the very thing taking happiness from his sister, the sister he'd sworn to shield from all that darkness. Roldan was not a good man in the conventional sense. He understood that and never deceived himself with comforting excuses. He had committed acts he told no one about and for which he expected no forgiveness. But he had his own principles, a harsh code he had followed his entire life: never betray those who trusted him, never profit from the weak, and never allow his blood to pay for choices only he had made. It was this code that set him apart from others in his world, and it was this code that was now cornering him. The fastest way to resolve everything, unfreeze the accounts, suffocate the investigation before it consumed Fior and her future, lay behind a door he never thought he'd have to knock on. He looked at the business card lying alone on the edge of the desk. Embossed on it was the name of a man the whole city respected, but no one trusted, a man who wielded such power in the shadows of finance and politics that he could slow a federal investigation or make it disappear entirely. Roldan understood that knocking on that door meant remaining in debt to someone he couldn't even predict. The price of that debt was unknown to him, but he knew it would be enormous. He picked up the card, turned it in his fingers under the dim light, feeling the raised letters. In the silence of the room, broken only by the soft lapping of the lake water outside the window, Roldan Vasquez, Lord of Shadows, accustomed to inspiring fear with his ruthless restraint, faced a truth for the first time in many years. Sometimes pride is a luxury even a syndicate head cannot afford. But even before that card appeared on his desk, even before the feds tightened their grip on the family's throat, another name had entered Roldan's life through a door he hadn't expected, and that name was connected to the final months of his mother's life. Cora Vasquez had fallen ill the previous winter. Her heart, weakened by years, increasingly refused to keep a steady rhythm. Roldan, a man who could buy almost anything, was forced to confront a bitter truth: his mother's health was not on the shopping list. He hired the best doctors, took her to the most expensive clinics, but the woman who changed Cora's final days was no famous medical luminary. It was a nurse recommended by one of the doctors, a woman named Adeline Fairmont. The first time Roldan saw her, he noted her imposing stature and quiet dignity despite her obvious physical imperfections, just as he noted every detail in every person who entered his house. But he didn't attach any significance to it, because at the time, the only thing occupying his heart was his mother. Gradually, however, his attention was drawn not to how Adeline looked, but to how she worked, the way she entered Cora's room every morning with genuine calm, the way her hands supported his mother when she needed to sit up without a trace of irritation or disgust, the way she spoke to her as a person rather than a fadding body. One night when Cora suffered a heart attack and panic erupted in the house, Adeline was the only one who kept a cool head. She recognized the signs of crisis before the on-call doctor arrived, performed everything necessary with steady hands, and kept Cora breathing while they waited for the ambulance. That night without her, Cora would have died weeks earlier. Roldan never forgot how that woman knelt by his mother's bed at dawn, her clothes rumpled, hair disheveled, face exhausted, but her eyes never leaving the patient's rising chest. He understood that what she gave wasn't written in any employment contract. In the following week, Cora lived longer than any doctor had predicted. And Roldan was certain this was Adeline's doing, not because she worked miracles, but because she had restored what the illness had stolen from his mother, the feeling that she was still a person whose life had meaning. The two women grew close in the way only a nurse and her patient can during the most intimate hours of human life. Often, passing his mother's door, Roldan would hear Cora laughing softly, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. Cora, always perceptive, had seen her share of life's hardships, and she saw in Adeline what all of Chicago had missed, because none of them looked deeper than her face. She saw a heart that had not hardened no matter how cruelly the world had treated its owner. And she saw a quiet strength that Adeline herself didn't even know she possessed. On one of her last evenings, when Cora understood that little time remained, she asked her son to come in, sit on the edge of the bed, and took his hand. Her fingers had grown thin but were still warm. In a weak but clear voice, she said she knew what kind of cold world he lived in. She had never blamed him for the choices he'd had to make after his father's death, but she feared one thing, that her son would live his entire life never allowing anyone to touch the real person buried beneath the armor he'd built around himself. Then she voiced a thought that had troubled her for many sleepless nights. She wanted him to marry Adeline, not out of pity for the girl, but because she believed Adeline was the only person who could see in him not a fearsome name but a living human being. and that two people rejected by the world for different reasons might find in each other a refuge that no amount of money or power could buy. Roldan intended to reject the idea. He wanted to say it was just his mother's drug-induced rambling, but Cora's eyes that night were strangely clear. She squeezed his hand and said this was the last thing she would ever ask of him, the only thing that would allow her to leave this world with peace in her heart. She asked him to promise that he would at least give this woman a chance, and in doing so, give himself one as well. He promised, not because he believed her words, but because he couldn't refuse the eyes that looked at him for the last time, as he knew they would be. 3 days later, Cora passed away quietly in her sleep. Adeline's hand rested gently on her forehead until the very last breath. After the funeral, Roldan paid Adeline generously for her work and let her go, believing that the promise he'd made to his mother was merely an emotional burden that would fade with time, something that would haunt him but he would never actually fulfill. He was wrong. Weeks later, when the federal storm broke over him and he sat in the dim study turning that business card in his fingers, he understood that the man who could save his family, the man the whole city simultaneously respected and feared, was none other than the father of the very nurse his dying mother had asked him to marry. The meeting took place late in the evening on the top floor of a glass tower, housing the headquarters of Meridian Capital. From the moment Roldan stepped into the dark-paneled office with its panoramic view of Chicago, he knew he had entered the domain of a man accustomed to winning. Gerald Fairmont rose from behind a desk as wide as a bridge, extended his hand with a flawless host's smile, and greeted Roldan with a handshake firm enough to convey confidence without crossing into aggression. Everything about the man was polished to perfection, from his custom-tailored suit that fit his still strong build despite his age, to his smoothly combed silver hair and deep, warm voice that delivered every word, as if the mere fact of the conversation was an honor he was bestowing. He offered Roldan a seat, poured him a glass of top-shelf liquor without asking if he wanted it, then settled into the chair opposite with the ease of a man with all the time in the world. He began with condolences for Cora's passing, noting that she had been a deeply respected woman and that his daughter had genuinely grown attached to her in her final days. Roldan remained impassive, sensing that every phrase this man spoke was placed with intent, like pieces on a chessboard. He waited, knowing that men like Gerald Fairmont didn't invite crime figures to their private offices merely to express sympathy. As expected, after a few minutes of polite conversation, Gerald set aside his glass, leaned his elbows on the desk, and spoke in a quieter, more confiding tone. He told Roldan he understood all the difficulties the Vasquez family was facing, better than one might imagine. There was no hint of threat in his words, only the concern of an old friend offering support. Yet it was precisely this calmness that alarmed Roldan more than any direct threat, because it meant this man knew things no one outside closed federal offices should know. Gerald continued, explaining that the investigation hanging over Roldan's head was not a passing storm that would settle on its own. He had connections where ordinary money couldn't reach, people in politics and the judiciary who owed him decades of accumulated favors. He added that one phone call could change the course of the investigation, slow it, weaken it, and let it die out as if it had never existed. Roldan listened, revealing not a single emotion, while the cold machinery of calculation had already begun working in his mind. He knew he wasn't as helpless as Gerald might think. He had his own moves, hidden cards that could turn the game in his favor, given enough time and patience. But he also understood those paths would require many months, perhaps years. Gerald offered speed, a decisive resolution Roldan couldn't achieve alone. And above all, time was the one thing Fior didn't have. Every new day linking the Vasquez name to a federal investigation pushed his sister's future further away. When Roldan finally spoke, his voice remained level, and he asked directly what this man wanted in return for such generous help. He had lived too long in a world built on deals to believe in free assistance, and the more kindness was used to mask the price, the more expensive that price ultimately became. Gerald smiled, a rehearsed warm smile so convincing it was almost impossible to distinguish from sincerity, and then voiced his demand in a tone as light as if he were offering some trivial arrangement. He said he had a daughter, Adeline, who, in his words, had reached the age to start a family, and he believed a union between her and Roldan would benefit both families. With the same relaxed expression, he added that he knew of their acquaintance during Adeline's care for his mother, and that this marriage would merely formalize an existing connection. In return, he promised to use all his influence to halt the investigation, unfreeze the accounts, and restore the Vasquez family to its rightful place. Roldan was silent for a long time, and in that silence 2 currents of thought collided within him. On one side, his instinctive suspicion of an offer so generous it could only be dangerous. His entire life had taught him that when an influential man is eager to marry off his daughter and attaches such a huge gift to it, something is always hidden beneath the surface. On the other hand, the image of his mother on her last night, her strangely clear eyes as she squeezed his hand and begged him to give that girl a chance. Gerald spoke Adeline's name as if she were an object to be passed from one owner to another. And this alone, how a father spoke of his daughter, never once mentioning her happiness or her wishes, planted a vague unease in Roldan's soul that he couldn't yet name. But he pushed it aside, because the answer to all his problems was now right in front of him, the answer that could save Fior and fulfill his mother's final wish in a single decision. He told Gerald he agreed, but on one condition: he wanted to meet Adeline alone, because no matter what the rest of the world thought of him, he was not the kind of man to marry by signing a contract without first looking into his bride's eyes. Gerald arranged the meeting reluctantly, as if allowing his daughter to be consulted was merely an annoying formality interrupting an already settled deal. He chose the sitting room of one of the Fairmont family homes, an elegant but lifeless space filled with expensive things arranged to impress rather than to live in. When Roldan entered, Adeline was already there. The first thing he noticed was that she stood in the center of the room by the window rather than sitting in the chair prepared for her, as if the very act of sitting would have been an invitation for him to look at her as much as he wanted, and she wasn't about to grant him that pleasure. She wore a simple dark blouse, no jewelry, no makeup attempting to hide the scar on her neck. Her chin was slightly raised, her broad shoulders straight. Roldan recognized that posture. It wasn't pride, but defense. The stance of someone who had learned to brace herself for the expression that was about to appear on her interlocutor's face. Before he could even greet her, she spoke first, her voice dry and calm, almost indifferent. She told him to look as much as he wanted, since apparently that was custom before buying goods, and that she would stand a little longer so he could decide whether this specimen was worth the price her father had named. There was no self-pity in her words, no trembling, no pleading, only bitterness honed over years of being looked at, judged, and evaluated by other people's eyes. It was this steely dryness that made Roldan, a man accustomed to tears and pleas, pause for a moment. He looked at her not as she expected. He didn't let his gaze slide with curiosity or disgust across the scar, her hair, or her figure. He looked directly into her eyes and held her gaze, then said he hadn't come to buy anything. Adeline laughed briefly, without warmth, and asked why he had come then, whether marriage was, in essence, the same kind of purchase, just accompanied by a certificate and a pair of vows both parties knew were lies. Roldan didn't dodge the question, choosing the only weapon he believed could pierce this woman's armor, unvarnished truth. He told her he wouldn't insult her by pretending he was marrying for love. They both understood the circumstances. But he wouldn't insult her by pretending to be repulsed by her either, as the world so often did, because he didn't see what they whispered about behind her back. She was silent for a moment, squinting as if searching for a trap hidden behind his words, because her whole life kindness had been either a commodity or a scheme. She asked, her voice slightly less sharp but still full of suspicion, what he saw in her. Roldan replied that he saw a woman who had stayed faithfully by his mother's side on nights when even he, her own son, hadn't found the courage to remain, a woman who gave what no contract required. And if the world measured human worth by a face, then the world was a fool and he had lived too long to remain one. It wasn't flattery, and it wasn't comfort. His voice remained even and cold, the same tone he used in business, and perhaps that was why the words reached their target. Adeline had received enough pity wrapped in soft tones to know the difference between that and what now stood before her, dry, unadorned respect that demanded no gratitude in return. For a moment she turned to the window, hiding what flickered across her face, then looked back at him and said she'd had very little choice in this matter, as had he, that her father had decided her fate long before Roldan walked into that room. And if they were both destined to play in someone else's play, she hoped he would at least remain true to the honesty he'd just shown, because she was unbearably tired of polished liars. Roldan nodded and promised her the only thing he could guarantee, that he would never lie to her, no matter how hard the truth might be, and that under his roof she would never again have to fear what she'd feared before. She looked at him for a long time after those words, and in that moment something barely perceptible passed between them, not affection, for it was too early to call it that, but recognition. a recognition between two people whom the world had, for different reasons, pushed to the margins. And when Roldan left that cold room, he carried with him the certainty that the woman he was about to marry was nothing like the one her father had described, and that behind her armor of sarcasm lay a story no one had ever troubled themselves to hear. When the car carried them away from the Grand Astoria ballroom through the lit streets of Chicago toward the lakeside estate, Adeline sat silently by the window. Beneath the light makeup she had reluctantly allowed, Roldan noticed her face was unnaturally pale. She hadn't spoken a word the entire drive, only occasionally shifting her posture before forcing herself still again, as if every movement cost her effort. He, unaccustomed to asking questions, also remained silent, assuming she was just exhausted after hours under the mocking gazes of 500 people. When they reached the estate, the old housekeeper Marisol was waiting in the foyer with her usual stern expression, and she was the first to sense something was wrong, for the sharp eyes of a woman who had served in this house for decades didn't miss how tightly the young woman gripped the stair railing. Roldan led Adeline to the room prepared for her, a spacious bedroom in the east wing with windows overlooking the dark lake. He intended to leave her alone, respecting the boundaries he had silently established in his mind for this marriage, but when she moved closer to the light he saw it. On the upper back of her ivory wedding dress, a dark stain was slowly spreading, seeping through layer after layer. For a moment his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing, until Adeline swayed. Roldan was already at her side, calling for Marisol, who appeared almost immediately with a medical bag, instinct honed over years telling her to bring it. Adeline weakly resisted, insisting she didn't need anyone's help, that she was a nurse and knew her own body better than anyone, but the dizziness made her voice waver. In the end, she allowed Marisol to seat her, turning away and clutching the edges of her dress to her chest with both hands. Marisol unfastened the hooks on the back, her hands trembling slightly. When the silk slid down, revealing Adeline's back, what he saw was not just a wound from that night, but a map of years lived, old scars, faded pale intersecting stripes, traces of old burns, and among them several fresh marks where fragile, barely healed skin had been abraded again under the weight and friction of the wedding dress. These were not the result of an accident, nor the aftermath of a fall or illness. No accident leaves such consistent repeating patterns, marks that could only appear again and again over many years from the hand of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Roldan Vasquez had seen much in his life, had stood before scenes from which an ordinary person would have turned away, and in all those moments he had maintained a composure so icy it frightened any observer. But now, standing in his own bedroom looking at the back of the woman he had just married, he felt something rising inside him that he hadn't felt in a very long time, a cold fury mixed with something dangerously close to pain. Marisol worked in silence, her practiced hands cleaning and bandaging the bleeding wounds with a mother's tenderness, occasionally whispering words of comfort in her hoarse voice. All the while Adeline didn't cry, didn't moan, she just sat with her back straight, staring at the wall before her with dry, empty eyes. And that silence, that ingrained endurance, wounded Roldan more deeply than any sobbing could have. He walked to the head of the bed, keeping his distance so she wouldn't feel cornered, and didn't ask the question that hung in the air. He didn't ask who had done this to her, because in that frozen moment, with the image of her flinching under Gerald's hand at the altar still fresh in his memory, part of the truth had already revealed itself, terrible and wordless. He understood that the true nightmare of this marriage wasn't the face the whole city mocked, but what had been hidden for years beneath the silk on the back of a woman no one in that dazzling ballroom had bothered to look at long enough to truly see. When Marisol finished dressing the wounds, she quietly put away the medical kit and left the room with a slight nod to the master of the house, leaving only Roldan and Adeline in the heavy silence. She broke it first, pulling the thin robe tighter over her shoulders as if trying to rebuild the wall that had just crumbled. Her voice was dry again, but now edged with sharp defensive notes. She threw at him that he shouldn't look at her like that she didn't need his pity or anyone else's, and that everything he'd just seen had nothing to do with their marriage contract, so he'd better forget it like any other unimportant detail. She built a barrier of words quickly and decisively, each phrase laying a brick to seal the breach her body had accidentally opened. She declared that she had been managing on her own for a very long time, that she didn't need a husband playing knight, and that the only thing she expected from this marriage was to be left alone. Roldan listened without interrupting, not trying to comfort her with empty words. He understood that with a woman like her, an awkward attempt to soothe would only prove he hadn't been listening. He stayed at the foot of the bed, maintaining the distance he'd kept from the start, his hands relaxed at his sides rather than crossed on his chest, a posture he chose deliberately so his appearance wouldn't evoke even a hint of threat. Then he, Roldan, began to speak, choosing his words carefully, as if treading on thin ice. He told her he wouldn't ask who had inflicted those wounds, not because he wasn't interested, but because he understood it was her story, and she would tell it when she was ready if that day ever came, not because he demanded it. Then he spoke words she would remember for many years. In this house under his roof, no one would be allowed to touch her without her consent, no one, including himself. He added that the door to her room had a lock, the key was on the inside, and she had every right to use it against anyone, even the man who had just become her husband on paper. Adeline looked at him for a long time, and something flickered in her eyes. In all her life, no man had ever given her the right to her own space and body. No one had ever told her she had the right to say no and that her refusal would be respected. She opened her mouth to answer with another cutting remark, a deeply ingrained defensive reflex, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she only asked, her voice much quieter than she'd intended, why it mattered to him. Why he cared whether she locked her door, when she was nothing more to him than the terms of a deal made with her father. Roldan paused for a moment. He didn't tell her about the promise he'd made to his dying mother, didn't mention how Cora had seen something special in her, because he felt the time wasn't right. Instead, he simply said that maybe it was because he too had lived too long in a world where people took from each other without asking, and he had long ago decided that such laws would not apply in his home. It was an honest answer that still kept the part of his soul that remained hidden from others. Adeline seemed to understand, realized this man was neither soft nor sentimental, that he remained as cold and closed as he had seemed from the start. But beneath that outer shell lived a code he was willing to follow at the cost of his own life, and one of his principles had just been placed in her hands like a shield. She didn't thank him, she wasn't used to handing out gratitude, but when he wished her good night and headed for the door, she called him back and told him her full real name, the one her father never used, Adeline, not the various nicknames others had devised for her. And if they were to live under the same roof, at least she wanted to be called by her name. Roldan paused at the threshold and turned. For the first time since they'd met, the corner of his mouth twitched in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. Then he nodded and repeated her name slowly and clearly once before closing the door, leaving her alone with the key now within her reach, a choice she'd been denied for far too long. The first days in the lakeside estate passed in an atmosphere of polite wariness. Adeline kept to the east wing, locking her door every night as Roldan had allowed, and they lived side by side like strangers in a house so vast they could go an entire day without crossing paths. Yet the person who drew Adeline out of the isolation she had voluntarily built was not Roldan, but Fior, his 26-year-old sister, who had moved in with her brother after her engagement began to fall apart. Fior was curious about the sister-in-law the whole city whispered about, but unlike the others, her curiosity held no malice. One afternoon, she knocked on Adeline's door with a tray of tea and a disarmingly hesitant expression, then stayed to talk far longer than either had expected. Fior was a girl raised in an atmosphere of care, beautiful and gentle, but strangely uncertain of herself. Adeline soon realized that this young woman, despite having everything the world considered well-being, was crumbling under the weight of quiet rejection from her fiancé and his family, simply because of the shame surrounding the Vasquez name. Through tears, Fior admitted she felt worthless, that perhaps she wasn't good enough for anyone to want to stay. And then Adeline, who understood better than anyone what it meant to be judged and discarded by others, said to her what no one had ever said to her when she was young, that a person's worth doesn't depend on whether someone else chose them, that a man who leaves at the first sign of trouble isn't a loss, but merely a revelation of his true nature, and that the worst thing you can do is make yourself smaller to beg for someone's approval. Spoken by a woman whose body bore so many scars, these words carried a weight that no support from someone who had never suffered could match. Fior grew attached to Adeline, as if she had finally found a source of strength she hadn't known existed. Two women, wounded in different ways, found in each other a quiet understanding. It was during those long afternoons over cooling tea that layers of Adeline's past began to open, not in a sudden flood of confessions, but slowly and cautiously, like water seeping through cracks in stone. One afternoon, when Fior casually asked about her mother, Adeline was silent for a long time before finally speaking in a voice so calm it was unsettling. She said her mother's name was Ingrid, that she was a gentle and intelligent woman, and that she died when Adeline was 18. People claimed her mother had fallen from a great height inside the family estate. A tragic accident described with the careful language people use when they've agreed on a single version of the truth. The word asterisk fell she pronounced with such a strange emphasis, as if she herself had never fully believed it. Fior, naive and far from such darkness, didn't understand what lay behind the story, but sensed the pain and didn't dare ask further, while Adeline said nothing more about the death, closing the door she had just cracked open, as if she had already revealed more than she intended. However, days later, on another evening when Fior spoke of her fear of seeming insane if she cried too much, another fragment of Adeline's history slipped out. She said she understood that fear far better than Fior could imagine, because after her mother's death, there had been a long period when she was sent to a place. At first she didn't name it, only said it was an institution, a place with high walls and locked doors where people claimed she needed care because her mind had been unhinged by the shock of losing her mother. She had spent nearly 2 or 3 years of her youth there, years she should have lived freely. Her voice became strangely even when she spoke of that time, the evenness of someone who had retold her pain so many times inside her own mind that it had turned to numbness. She said most of the scars on her body came from those years, though she stopped there and didn't explain how. Fior, despite her youth, was perceptive enough to understand that dark truths lay behind those brief words. She took her sister-in-law's hand without speaking, just holding it in her own. And Adeline, accustomed to bearing everything alone, allowed her to hold her hand without pulling away, a small concession that meant an incredible amount to her. Later, sitting alone by the window overlooking the lake, Adeline wondered why she had let those broken fragments escape. She had kept everything secret for so many years. She understood that perhaps for the first time in her life under this strange roof, between a naive sister-in-law who trusted her and a husband who had placed the key to her bedroom door in her hand, she was beginning to feel, ever so slightly and slowly, safe enough that she no longer needed to keep everything locked away. Adeline, without realizing it, was gradually opening pieces of her shattered past to Fior in the west wing of the estate. In the dark study where he was accustomed to conducting affairs never spoken of in daylight, Roldan quietly began his own investigation. He hadn't asked Adeline a single question, as he'd promised, but his silence didn't mean he had forgotten the back covered in countless scars that he'd seen on their wedding night. On the contrary, that image had burned into him a cold resolve. For a man whose connections reached into the darkest corners of Chicago, there were ways to dig for the truth without making Adeline relive that pain. He summoned one of his most trusted men, a former investigator now working personally for the family, and gave him a single task: learn everything possible about the missing years of Adeline Fermont's life and the place where she had been sent after her mother's death. The work was not easy. Records of treatment and confinement in private institutions were protected by patient confidentiality laws, and someone had gone to great lengths to cover the tracks. But money and the right connections opened doors closed to ordinary law, and step by step, fragments of information began to return to Roldan's hands. He learned the name of the institution where Adeline had been held, an expensive private psychiatric clinic in the northern suburbs where wealthy families sent their relatives to hide them from prying eyes. From the first lines of the report, something caught his attention. The idea that a healthy 18-year-old girl who had just lost her mother could be locked away in such a place for years was incomprehensible even to a man far removed from medicine. The deeper his people dug, the more suspicious gaps appeared in the records. Periods when regular examinations should have taken place were completely blank. The same surnames appeared repeatedly in signatures, and the overall impression was that the whole file had been fabricated rather than kept honestly. But the detail that truly made Roldan stop, the one that had him reading the same line again and again under the dim lamplight, was mentioned only briefly toward the end of Adeline's stay at the clinic. A fire, according to the official report, flames broke out in one of the buildings one night and were attributed to faulty wiring. There were several injured, including Adeline, who suffered the burns now accounting for most of the scars on her body. The report was so smooth, as if it were just an unfortunate incident, but it was precisely that flawlessness that aroused Roldan's suspicion. Life had taught him that when a story is told so smoothly it leaves no loose ends, it's a sure sign someone deliberately smoothed it over. He gave his investigator questions the report didn't answer. Why did a fatal electrical failure occur in an expensive facility with carefully maintained systems? Why did the most seriously injured in the fire all belong to one specific group of patients, not scattered randomly as in an ordinary accident? And why was no independent investigation conducted afterward, even though several people had sustained severe injuries? Each question opened the door to the next, and Roldan felt as if he were pulling a thread in a piece of fabric, discovering with each tug that the cloth had been woven only to conceal something far greater than an accident. He didn't rush to conclusions, too cautious to trust suspicions without evidence, but instincts honed by years in a world of intrigue told him that the night fire was not as simple as it appeared on paper. And as he sat among those documents, a new tension began to build within him. He realized he was being drawn into this woman's life far deeper than the original deal had intended. The anger he felt thinking about what she had endured was no longer the cold anger of an outside observer. It was something far more personal and dangerous for a man like him who had always sworn not to let emotions cloud his judgment. He closed the folder, looked out at the dark lake, and understood he had gone too far to turn back. He would have to learn the whole truth about that night, not out of some abstract sense of justice, but for the woman sleeping behind a locked door in the East Wing, a woman he was beginning to care about far more than he should, though he still couldn't bring himself to admit it even to himself. The thread Roldan was pulling in his attempt to unravel the mystery of the fire had temporarily led him to a dead end. Opening the right doors required more time. But the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life in a world built on deals told him that sometimes the answer is hidden not where you're looking, but where a signature already stands. He summoned the family's lead attorney and ordered him to bring the marriage contract he'd signed with Gerald Vermont, a document he'd skimmed in haste, feeling cornered. He spread it under the lamplight in his study, rereading every line this time with the patience and clarity of a man whose judgment was no longer clouded by crisis. His attorney, a cautious man who had spent many nights dissecting every clause, pointed out details Roldan had missed on first reading. Deep within paragraphs overloaded with legal jargon, carefully concealed behind dry language about marital property and inheritance rights, lay a scheme crafted with such precision that only a trained eye could recognize its true purpose. The contract stated that in the event of Adeline's death, or if a medical commission declared her incompetent to manage her own affairs, all assets registered in her name would not pass to her husband Roldan, as custom would normally dictate, but would return to the control of her legal guardian, and that guardian, clearly specified in a secondary clause, was none other than her own father, Gerald Vermont. Roldan read that line twice, then a third time, and a chill ran down his spine. He understood that the trap had never been set for him or the Vasquez family. It was aimed directly at Adeline herself, and he, by signing, had unwittingly become a link in a mechanism created long before his appearance. But what turned the whole matter from suspicious to truly horrifying was the next fact his attorney provided, the result of tracing the asset stream mentioned in that clause. When they traced the origin of Adeline's fortune to its source, they discovered it didn't belong to Gerald Vermont at all, despite what everyone had always believed. All of Chicago knew Gerald as a wealthy financial magnate and chairman of a prestigious investment corporation, and everyone believed the Vermont fortune was self-made. But the truth, buried under layers of documentation, told a completely different story. The real wealth, the fortune that was the foundation of all the luxury surrounding Gerald, had originally belonged to Ingrid, his late wife and Adeline's mother. Ingrid came from an old wealthy lineage, and when she married Gerald, her money had transformed him from an ambitious man into a powerful figure in the financial world. More importantly, according to old documents Roldan's attorney had found, Ingrid had stipulated that the bulk of that inheritance pass not to her husband, but to her only daughter. This meant that Adeline, the woman the world considered worthless, the woman her own father treated as a commodity for exchange, was actually the rightful heir to one of the largest fortunes in the city, a fortune almost no one knew existed. Meanwhile, Gerald had spent all those years controlling what legally should have belonged to his daughter. Roldan sat motionless before this truth, and in his mind all the scattered pieces began to form a picture that made him shudder, because the motive was now clear with cruel certainty. The heiress was the only obstacle between her father and the fortune he had grown accustomed to considering his own, and the legal mechanism was already in motion. If the daughter died or was declared mentally incompetent, everything would lawfully and indisputably return to him. Roldan immediately understood that this marriage had never been simply a deal to save the Vasquez family, but merely one move in a much larger game Gerald had begun long ago, and that giving Adeline away to a crime boss already surrounded by trouble could have been the final step in executing a plan whose true scope Roldan still couldn't fully grasp. But Roldan was too hardened to act on emotion. Though everything inside him boiled, he ordered his attorney to keep everything they'd learned in strictest secrecy and to reveal nothing outside that room. He knew that if Gerald realized his son-in-law had sensed the trap, he would simply change tactics and move faster. Roldan decided to continue playing the role of grateful son-in-law, maintaining the appearance of a stable marriage while slowly tightening the noose of his own investigation. Now he was protecting not just a wife who existed only on paper. He stood between Adeline and a man who had calculated his own daughter's death, as if it were just another entry in a ledger. Understanding that Gerald couldn't have created such an intricate trap alone, Roldan redirected the investigation to the names that kept appearing in the records from those years Adeline was confined, the very signatures he'd noticed from the start, but hadn't yet had time to pursue. The first name to emerge was a psychiatrist named Preston Cole, whose signature appeared on nearly every document related to Adeline's commitment to the clinic and the decisions that kept her there year after year. When Roldan's people began digging into his past, a deeply troubling portrait gradually emerged. Preston Cole was a licensed physician, respected in the city's medical circles, but behind that pristine reputation lay a chain of questionable stories that only became apparent when someone took the trouble to connect them. Patients from wealthy families who were suspiciously declared incompetent, psychiatric evaluations signed with astonishing speed just before major property disputes, and inexplicable money transfers to his accounts at the most critical moments. Roldan understood he was looking at a man who had turned medical authority into a commodity, ready for generous payment to put his signature and seal on a declaration that a healthy person was insane, just to satisfy the greed of those who needed that paper to give their schemes an appearance of legality. But Cole wasn't working alone. For such fabrication to hold up under legal scrutiny, something more than a medical opinion was needed, an entire legal structure built with particular care. The second name Roldan's network uncovered was a lawyer named Wallace Thorne. Thorne had served as Gerald Fairmont's legal counsel for years, remaining a quiet figure always in the shadows. It was his hand that turned Cole's diagnoses into flawless legal documents, guardianship petitions, powers of attorney, carefully concealed clauses woven into contracts, exactly like the clause Roldan had found in his own marriage agreement. The further Roldan followed the trail, the clearer he saw how these three worked together like a mechanism that had been carefully oiled for years. Cole provided the appearance of medical legitimacy. Thorne built a legal structure that seemed impossible to challenge. Gerald stood above them both, directing everything with his power and connections. Each had a role, and each received a share of the reward that bound them in a circle of mutual complicity. What put Roldan on highest alert was the realization that these weren't just cruel people acting recklessly or impulsively. They were intelligent, educated, respected people who had learned to hide their crimes behind a mask of professionalism and the protection of the law. And that made them more dangerous than any street criminal, because they could destroy a human life without leaving a single fingerprint on their weapon. He also understood that Thorne was not a blindly loyal servant, but a man so cautious that his caution had turned into suspicion. Such people always leave themselves a way out. Instinct told Roldan that Thorne had probably kept copies of the very documents he'd helped create, not out of conscience, but as insurance in case his partners decided to betray him. This thought opened a new path for Roldan. If Thorne truly had originals of the evidence from that scheme created years ago, it could be the key to destroying the entire mechanism. He began considering how to approach such a cautious man without alarming the other members of the network. Gathering everything together, Roldan remembered he had to act with extreme caution and not rush to conclusions, because behind every uncovered name stood a person with enough resources and motives to strike back. One small mistake could destroy everything he'd achieved and put Adeline in even greater danger. Late at night, he sat in his study looking at the three names written on the paper before him: Gerald Fairmont, Preston Cole, Wallace Thorne. He drew lines between them, watching a web of betrayal take shape, a web that had closed around the life of the woman sleeping in the East Wing since she was too young to protect herself. In that moment, Roldan understood that the war he was entering was unlike any he had known before. Because this time his enemies carried not weapons, but pens. They didn't hide in the dark but stood openly in the light under the cover of their respectability, and to defeat them, he would have to use the only weapon he had never trusted in his life: truth brought to light before the face of the law. While Roldan tightened the noose of his investigation in the shadows, life outside had to maintain the appearance of normalcy. One evening, the Vasquez family hosted a formal reception at the estate to celebrate the union of the two families, an event Gerald had insisted upon to dispel rumors and show the whole city that this marriage was a strong, reliable alliance. Adeline didn't like such gatherings, but she understood the role expected of her and appeared in an elegant dark dress, standing beside Roldan among guests who she knew had come more out of curiosity than goodwill. Marisol, whose devotion had become instinct after so many years running the household, personally oversaw the service, moving between tables with a sharp eye that missed nothing. She was the one who brought Adeline a glass of water, noticing the young woman looked tired in the noise of the crowd. But as Marisol set the glass on the table beside Adeline, someone in the crowd accidentally bumped her. She had to quickly set down the tray and take the glass intended for Adeline in her own hand to keep it from spilling. In that brief moment of confusion, driven by the habit of a servant who never wastes anything, she decided to take a small sip to wet her dry throat before serving another glass to her mistress. In that very instant, as Marisol brought the water to her lips, Adeline, whose vigilance had been sharpened by years of caring for patients, noticed something unusual. A faint cloudy film on the surface, a strange shimmer in the chandelier light that shouldn't be in ordinary water, and a barely detectable smell so subtle it was almost impossible to detect, but sharp enough to alert the part of her mind trained to recognize medications and chemicals. She reacted faster than she could think, reaching out and knocking the glass from Marisol's hands just before she could take a sip. The glass struck the stone floor and shattered. In the corner of the hall, silence fell. Everyone turned to them with faces mixing surprise and irritation. Marisol looked at her young mistress in confusion, not yet understanding what had happened. Adeline stood breathing heavily, her eyes fixed on the liquid spreading across the floor, a terrible certainty growing in her mind. The glass hadn't contained just water, and if Marisol hadn't accidentally picked it up, Adeline herself would have been the one to drink it. Roldan, standing nearby, immediately recognized his wife's expression, the tension he had learned to read. He crossed the room in a few steps and approached her quietly but insistently, asking if she was all right. Adeline didn't answer immediately. She bent down and used a napkin to collect the liquid remaining on a shard of glass, acting with the caution of someone who knew she was preserving an important sample. Then she looked up at her husband and whispered so softly that only he could hear. Someone had just tried to harm her, and Marisol had nearly paid for it with her life. The hall still buzzed with whispers about the bride's awkwardness in breaking a glass, and none of the guests realized what had just happened before their eyes. It was this contrast, between carefree light laughter and the death that had passed within centimeters of them, that made the moment the most frightening of all. Roldan immediately signaled one of his trusted men. With a single glance, he ordered the reception to be ended as quickly and calmly as possible, ensuring no one left the estate without supervision. Outwardly, he maintained the composure of a gracious host, smiling and apologizing to guests for the minor incident, completely hiding the storm raging inside. When the last guests had gone and silence fell over the house, Marisol, finally realizing what she had narrowly escaped, collapsed into a chair, pale and trembling. Adeline went to her, knelt, and took the elderly housekeeper's hands with the tenderness she showed her patients, assuring her the danger had passed. But even as she comforted Marisol, Adeline was already thinking in another direction, coldly and clearly. She was no longer a helpless woman trembling after a narrowly avoided death. She was a nurse. She understood the symptoms and effects of poisons better than anyone else in this house. She looked at the napkin holding the liquid sample with the eyes of someone who had just found the first clue. Roldan stood beside her, and in their exchange of glances something had changed, without words but with immense force. The enemy in the dark was no longer just reaching for their property or reputation, he had escalated to attempting her life. They both understood that the game had entered a new, far more dangerous phase, and there was no turning back. Early in the morning, while Roldan was busy strengthening the estate's security, Adeline took the napkin she had carefully preserved and went to an old acquaintance from her nursing days, a lab technician at a private testing center whom she trusted enough to ask for complete confidentiality. She didn't want to rely entirely on someone else, because her own medical knowledge had allowed her to suspect something was wrong from the moment she saw the faint film on the water's surface. When the test results came back, they confirmed her secret fears. The substance dissolved in the glass wasn't some cheap poison anyone could buy at a pharmacy, but a highly concentrated sedative from a class she immediately recognized, a strictly controlled medication rarely found outside specialized medical facilities. In the dosage found in the glass, it would plunge the victim into a deep unconscious state, after which breathing would quietly stop. Death in such a case would look more like a natural cardiac arrest than deliberate poisoning. It was this sophistication that made Adeline shudder, because it meant the perpetrator wasn't some street killer, but someone with medical training capable of obtaining drugs unavailable to ordinary people. Her mind, sharpened by years in healthcare, immediately drew a parallel with the only place she knew where such medications were stored in sufficient quantities, and with complete lack of control, the very institution where she had once been confined, where she had personally seen how dangerous the gaps in medication dispensing and tracking procedures could be. She didn't yet know that Roldan, in his own investigation, had arrived at the same name. Alone, she pieced together the puzzle, realizing that the poisoning attempt the previous evening wasn't a random threat, but directly connected to the past she had so desperately tried to bury. However, before she could share her discovery with her husband, the situation took a sudden turn. Someone anonymously reported the strange incident at the Vasquez reception to the police, and that same day, an inspector named Hollis Brandt appeared at the estate with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to uncovering the secrets of the wealthy. Brandt was experienced, perceptive, and extremely skeptical, and from the start he approached the case with almost inevitable bias, because in the eyes of a seasoned detective, when a dangerous incident occurs in the home of a man with a reputation as a crime boss already under federal investigation, the first person to question should be the master of the house. He asked Roldan carefully crafted questions, subtly hinting that the poisoning could have been staged, or worse, that Roldan himself had reasons to be rid of a wife he'd married only for convenience. The pressure of Brandt's penetrating gaze began to weigh heavily on Roldan's shoulders. Adeline watched the interrogation from the sidelines, and what surprised her most was that she, without a moment's hesitation, stepped forward to defend her husband. In a calm, clear voice, she told Inspector Brandt that she was the one who had discovered the poisoned water, that without her vigilance the housekeeper would have been the victim, and that as a medical professional she had personally sent a sample for analysis and now possessed evidence confirming the nature of the substance used. Her initiative and competence made Brandt pause. He hadn't expected the woman the whole city considered a passive victim to present the facts with such clarity and professional authority. Though he didn't abandon his suspicions of Roldan, his view of Adeline had shifted, gaining a new measure of cautious respect. When the inspector left, promising to continue the investigation, Adeline and Roldan were alone. She turned to him, placed the lab results on the table, and explained the conclusion she had reached about the possible source of the drug. In that moment, they realized that though they had been traveling different paths, both were moving toward the same goal, and it was time to stop hiding what they knew from each other. The following night, after Adeline and Roldan had finally revealed everything they knew to each other and hidden all their investigative documents in the fortified archive room on the first floor, something from the west wing of the estate, where Roldan kept his most secret family papers, warned the person behind it all that the net around him was tightening too much. Near midnight, when almost everyone in the house was asleep, a strange smell of smoke began to creep through the corridors. Adeline, whose sleep had been restless since the poisoning attempt, was the first to wake and recognize it. She jumped out of bed, opened her door, and saw a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the stairs leading to the first floor. In that instant, one thought flashed through her mind: the archive room, where all the evidence they had so painstakingly gathered was stored, evidence capable of exposing the entire network that had destroyed her life. She raced down the stairs, shouting to wake the household, and when she reached the ground floor, saw that the door to the archive room was already on fire. Flames licked at the wooden frame, and an angry orange glow blazed from inside. The documents were already beginning to burn. Roldan appeared almost instantly, grabbed her shoulders, and shouted that she couldn't go in, that documents could be replaced but a human life couldn't. But Adeline understood better than anyone. Some of the original evidence they had so desperately gathered could never be replaced if it turned to ash. All hope of bringing those people to light would vanish with the smoke. She didn't act recklessly. On the contrary, her years of medical training told her exactly what to do. She grabbed a large cloth, quickly wet it in a nearby container of water, wrapped it around her nose and mouth, then crouched low beneath the smoke pooling at the ceiling and moved swiftly and decisively toward the steel safe in the corner where the most important documents were stored. When Roldan realized he couldn't stop her, instead of standing and watching, he immediately went after her, and together they began working in the suffocating smoke. He used his strength to pry open the safe door that had been jammed by the heat, while she quickly gathered folders and a small metal box and pressed them to her chest. Waves of heat washed over them, smoke stung their eyes and burned their lungs. At one moment, a burning section of the ceiling collapsed, blocking their path to the exit, making both their hearts seem to stop. But Roldan pulled her along the wall toward a side door he knew, shielding her with his body each time burning debris fell around them. They burst outside just as the estate's security team arrived with extinguishers, both collapsing onto the dew-soaked grass, coughing heavily, covered in soot, while Adeline still clutched the files and the metal box for which she had risked her life. The fire was brought under control before it spread to the rest of the house, but most of the archive room was destroyed, and that told them both this was no accident. The culprit knew exactly what needed to be burned and where it was stored. This truth chilled them to the bone, because it meant there was an informant in their close circle. When the panic finally subsided, Adeline sat on the grass, not loosening her grip on the metal box, and looked at Roldan through the lingering haze in the air. They both understood. Her dangerous but calculated act had just saved the one thing that could change the course of this entire war. Roldan reached out and wiped a streak of soot from her cheek with such unexpected tenderness that it seemed to surprise even him, a gesture he had never allowed himself to show before. In that fragile moment among the ashes, the feelings they had both tried so long to suppress became clearer than ever, leaving no room for denial. But even as his heart softened toward her, Roldan's mind coldly noted one fact: the metal box in his wife's hands, which she had instinctively chosen to save, might contain far more secrets than either of them could imagine. Inside the metal box, for which Adeline had risked her life, among the fire-scorched papers lay a silver locket and an old note written in her mother's hand, personal treasures Adeline had kept locked away for years. As they wiped away soot in a room still heavy with the smell of smoke, these quiet remnants of the past awakened a long-forgotten memory in her. She remembered her mother, Ingrid, personally altering her wedding dress and insisting it be saved for Adeline's wedding day, repeating that a mother's protection should always be closest to the body. Connecting her mother's words from the note with the painful friction of the dress's seams on her wedding night, the truth suddenly struck her like a flash of light. A powerful instinct pulled her to her feet. She hurried to where the wedding dress had been cleaned and hung after that night. Under Roldan's watchful gaze, she ran her fingers along the seam on the back where the fabric had absorbed her blood, until she felt an unusual lump beneath the lining. Taking scissors, she cut the hidden stitches, and from the opening a tightly rolled waterproof microdocument fell into her palm. Her mother had sewn it into the dress over 10 years ago, hiding it on her daughter's body in the last and most secure place she could imagine, a message sent from beyond the grave. When Roldan scanned the document and displayed it on the screen, the truth finally opened, and it was far more terrible than they could have imagined. Inside were documents, audio recordings, and evidence that Ingrid had quietly gathered in the last months of her life. She had learned that her husband Gerald was appropriating and embezzling the fortune she had brought into their marriage, creating an entire web of forged papers with the help of attorney Wallace Thorne. And when she, an honest woman, decided to bring everything to light to protect her daughter's future, she signed her own death warrant. The death that 10 years ago everyone had called a tragic fall was no accident. It was Gerald's way of silencing a wife who had become a threat, and it was so artfully concealed that no one dared question it. But the most horrifying revelation, which made Adeline tremble as she read, was the true reason she had been sent to the psychiatric institution where she spent her youth. She had never been insane. She had been locked away only because she was the sole living witness to what her mother had feared in her final days. Adeline was the one Ingrid had managed to whisper her suspicions to before her death, and to ensure such a daughter could never speak out, Gerald and Dr. Preston Cole turned her into a madwoman on paper, imprisoning her behind walls where no one would believe a single word she said. Even the fire at the institution years ago, which had left burns on her body, now appeared in a new frightening light, as an attempt to erase her from the face of the earth. Adeline sat motionless before the screen. All those years she had doubted her own sanity, all those nights she wondered if she really was broken, as everyone around her insisted, all of it collapsed under the weight of the truth. She had always been right. Her instincts about her mother's death had never failed her. The tears she had held back for so many years finally flowed, but they weren't tears of weakness, they were tears of pain that had finally found justification after all this time. Roldan knelt beside her, not trying to offer empty words. He simply held her, letting the woman who had borne everything alone for so long finally lean on someone else's strength. In that moment, he understood that what he had discovered beneath her wedding dress that night, what had started it all, had now led them to the endgame. The voice of a woman long dead had risen again, demanding justice for herself and her daughter. As if sensing the net tightening and the evidence slipping from his grasp, Gerald Fairmont decided to strike first, calculating that this move would bring any opponent to their knees. He personally invited Roldan to a meeting, not in the luxurious offices of Meridian Capital, but in a more secluded place. He arrived with the composure of a man who believed he still held all the cards, unaware that his son-in-law had found the flash drive. Gerald began in his warm, carefully rehearsed tone, saying he knew how much the federal investigation was pressing on the Vasquez family, that he understood Roldan was a practical man who knew how to weigh profit and loss, and that he had come with an offer any wise man would accept. He laid it out with casual lightness, as if discussing an ordinary investment. He stated that Adeline had always been mentally unstable, a fact doctors had confirmed years ago, and that her condition had recently worsened again. Strange behavior, unpredictability, even suspicion that she herself was involved in the unpleasant incidents at the estate. Gerald proposed that if Roldan agreed to cooperate and sign documents declaring Adeline incompetent, returning her to where she could supposedly receive proper care, he would in return use all his influence to close the federal investigation, unfreeze the accounts, and moreover, allow Roldan to retain full control over the vast fortune registered in her name. He presented everything with such chilling coldness, as if burying his own daughter alive was just another clause in a commercial contract. He concluded that a man like Roldan owed nothing to a wife he'd married only for convenience, and that no one in their right mind would refuse an entire fortune for a woman the whole city mocked. Roldan listened in silence, his face expressionless, as befits a man accustomed to hiding his thoughts his entire life, but within that silence a war raged. He knew the offer was real. He knew Gerald indeed had enough power to deliver everything promised. With one signature, all the problems Roldan had been fighting for weeks would disappear. The Vasquez family would be saved, Fior's future secured, and he himself would become richer than he had ever dreamed. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been groomed for his whole life, a deal promising profit from all sides, if evaluated on the cold scales of calculation. There was one brief moment, a moment he wouldn't later be proud of but would never deny, when the cold businessman inside him, accustomed to regarding emotion as a dangerous luxury, weighed the price of refusal. But then he remembered the scars on Adeline's back seen in the wedding night light, her face when she read the truth from her mother's note, and finally found peace after years of doubting her own sanity. He remembered his mother's eyes on her last night, asking him to give this girl a chance. And he understood that the man opposite him was asking him to commit the very evil that had once destroyed Adeline's life, to make her insane again, to silence her forever. Roldan raised his eyes to Gerald, revealing none of what he already knew. He answered in a low, measured voice that this was a serious offer requiring consideration, and asked Gerald to give him a few days to settle his affairs. It was an answer meant to buy time. Gerald, absolutely certain that all men were driven solely by self-interest, accepted this with the smile of a man already counting victory as his own. But when Roldan left that meeting, he knew for certain that the decision within him was already made, and for the first time in his life he chose a person over his own gain, even if the price of that choice was everything he owned. The few days Roldan had asked for to think were spent not in hesitation, but in preparation. He understood that to defeat a man like Gerald, it wasn't enough to simply say no. He had to turn that refusal into irrefutable weaponry. He summoned his attorney, and instead of signing the papers Gerald expected, drafted his own document, an official notarized statement detailing Gerald's proposal, how he had demanded his wife be declared incompetent in exchange for ending the federal case and transferring the fortune, and formally rejected the entire offer outright. By placing his signature under this document, Roldan didn't just say no, he voluntarily rejected the path to salvation Gerald had offered. He was aware that the Vasquez family would now have to face the investigation alone, and that he might lose absolutely everything. By making this choice, he turned it into living proof that he valued human dignity above personal gain, and this document would later serve as testimony that he had never been on the side of those who destroyed his wife's life. That evening he came to Adeline and for the first time since they'd met, told her everything he had kept in his heart for so long, not with flowery phrases, but with the disarmingly sincere honesty that was his true nature. He told her about the meeting with her father, the offer made to him, and how he had refused it. When he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, wondering if he had hesitated for even a second, he didn't look away. He admitted there had been a moment when the old him inside had weighed the cost of that choice, because he didn't want to build anything with her on a lie, even one that would make him look noble in the eyes of others. Then he explained why he had ultimately made that decision. He told her about his mother, about that last night when Cora held his hand and begged him to give her a chance. He confessed that only now did he truly understand what his mother had seen. She had wanted to save not only a poor girl, but him as well, pulling him out of the cold world where everything was bought and sold. He told her he owed that truth to his mother, and that he was in incalculable debt to Adeline herself, because her entire life, those who should have protected her had turned her into a commodity and painted her as insane. He couldn't become another man for whom she was just a bargaining chip, even if the price was an entire fortune. Adeline listened to him in silence, and tears rolled down the face the whole city had once mocked. But this time they weren't tears of pain, they came from something so unfamiliar she could barely recognize it. It was the feeling that someone was choosing to be with her not for gain, but simply because she was who she was. In a breaking voice, she told him that in all her life, no one had ever taken her side when it required sacrifice. She had grown accustomed to kindness being a trap, and she simply didn't know how to handle tenderness that demanded nothing in return. Roldan took her hand and said she didn't need to do anything, that she owed him nothing, that he had done it not for her love but because it was the right thing to do, and that even if she decided to leave when it was all over, he would have done exactly the same. In that moment between two people whom fate had pushed to the margins of life for different reasons, a quiet healing began, not the kind that erases scars, but the kind that comes when someone finally appears who looks at those scars and doesn't walk away. They both understood that even if the fight ahead was hard, they would go through it together. Instead of settling scores with Gerald in the shadows, as the laws of the criminal world from which he came demanded, Roldan chose a path he had never truly believed in. He brought all the evidence directly to the federal investigators handling his family's case. Using the evidence Ingrid had gathered, along with the documents Adeline had risked her life to save from the fire, he turned those who had been hunting him into instruments of justice. The confrontation didn't take place in a crowded courtroom, but in a federal office where prosecutors, attorneys and Inspector Hollis Brandt, who, after examining the evidence, had completely changed his view of the case, were present. In exchange for full cooperation and significant financial settlements to legalize the family business, the federal prosecutors agreed to drop the racketeering case against the Vasquez estate. At the center of this meeting stood Adeline, and all eyes in the room were fixed on the woman who had once been declared insane. She presented her arguments without wavering or stumbling for a second, with clarity, precision, and deep calm. Using her medical knowledge, she explained exactly what had been in the water glass, pointed out every contradiction in her old medical records, and proved she had never been the incompetent person they had invented. She placed on the table the contents of the flash drive, the evidence her mother had gathered regarding Gerald's asset embezzlement, and her deep fear in the final days of her life. Adeline's voice remained steady as she declared that for 10 long years, she had been silenced only because she was the only one who knew what her mother had truly feared. Then came the testimony of Mrs. Marisol. The old housekeeper described in vivid detail the poisoning at the reception, how she herself had nearly become a victim, and how Adeline had saved her. It was a direct, credible witness account from someone who had no reason to lie, but the decisive blow came from the paranoia of the lawyer Wallace Thorne himself. As Roldan had predicted, this cautious man had secretly kept copies of all the forged documents he had compiled over the years, not out of conscience, but as insurance to blackmail others or save himself in case of betrayal. When investigators uncovered those papers, the entire network began to collapse, facing the prospect of bearing full responsibility for his co-conspirators. Thorne decided to speak in exchange for a reduced sentence. He revealed everything: how Gerald had orchestrated the entire operation, how Dr. Preston Cole sold his signature and official seal to declare a healthy girl insane, and how the three had conspired for years to keep Adeline confined and seize Ingrid's fortune. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Cole lost his self-important demeanor as a respected physician and crumbled. His professional career ended the moment the medical board intervened, revoking his license and opening the way for criminal prosecution for unlawful imprisonment. But the moment when dead silence fell over the room came when Gerald, who had maintained his manufactured composure to the very end, was cornered by his own daughter's words. In a rare uncontrolled outburst of rage, he shouted words that sealed his fate, declaring that if Ingrid had only stayed quiet as she'd been warned, none of this would have happened, and that she had brought her fate upon herself by deciding to ruin everything. That phrase, spoken right in front of federal investigators, was an admission that he had known everything in advance and had allowed his wife to die. In that instant when those words left his lips, the flawless image of Gerald Fairmont, built over a lifetime, finally crumbled. Gerald was arrested immediately along with Cole. He was led away, while former allies who had once orbited around him turned their backs. Adeline stood in the silence watching her father, the man who had destroyed her youth, being led out of the room. She didn't feel triumph, only quiet calm, the sensation that after 10 long years of silence, justice had finally been served, and the voice that had been silenced for so long had finally been heard. When it was all over, and the Fairmont name ceased to be a shadow hanging over her life, Roldan found Adeline and did something no one had ever done for her in her 28 years. He gave her a choice. He told her their marriage had begun under duress, as a deal she had never been asked about. But now that she was free, now that her mother's fortune had returned to her, now that no one could lock her away or decide her fate, she had every right to leave and start a new life if she wished, and he would not hold her back. Adeline looked at him for a long time, at the man who had refused an entire fortune rather than betray her, who had stayed by her side when it brought him no gain. She asked him if he wanted her to stay. And Roldan, accustomed to hiding any emotion, answered her with brutal honesty for the first time. Yes, but he added that his wish was no more important than her own choice, because her decision should always come first. And she chose to stay, not because she needed his protection, but because for the first time in her life she wanted to be with someone of her own free will. They exchanged new vows in a private ceremony, without the 500 mocking guests, without the luxurious chandeliers hiding cruelty, without the father whose hand pressed down on her shoulder. The only witnesses were Fior and Mrs. Marisol. And this time the words they spoke were real. They had chosen them, not bought them. Adeline didn't forget the years she had lost or the nameless people who might share her fate. With the fortune her mother had left her, she founded a fund for legal and medical aid for those unlawfully detained under the pretext of mental health care, people who had been silenced for others' greed, so that no one else would have to face an entire system alone as she had. As for Roldan, this journey had changed him. He began gradually moving his family's affairs out of the shadows, steering them toward legitimate channels, because he had understood that the strongest power is not the one that makes people afraid, but the one you don't have to hide in the light. On one quiet evening, Adeline stood by the window looking out at the lake. Her thinning hair was loose, the scars on her neck no longer hidden, and she was no longer the bride all of Chicago had called the ugliest on that memorable night in the Grand Astoria ballroom. She had become a woman finally seen for who she truly was and accepted as she was. Roldan came up behind her and covered her hand with his, not to control her, but simply because that was where he wanted to be. The story of Adeline and Roldan teaches us a profound lesson. A person's worth is never found in their face or appearance, but in their heart and dignity. Those whom the world hastily judges and discards are often the strongest and most noble, and true kindness is what you give without expecting anything in return. This story also reminds us that respect for human dignity, the ability to hear quiet, silenced voices, and the courage to stand up for the truth even at a high price are what give life its true meaning. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with loved ones so we can continue to hear more deep stories together every day. It matters to us to know what you felt listening to this story. Did it remind you of something in your own life? Have you ever seen someone unfairly judged because of their appearance? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts, because we always read and value every word you share. Thank you for spending this time with us by our cozy fire until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful and peaceful life filled with love every day. Goodbye and see you in the next story.